So one Saturday, Jesus was walking through a grain field with his disciples, and they got a little hungry. So they started to pluck a few heads of grain. They would have run it through their hands to get rid of the outer husk and the chaff, maybe blown on it a little bit, and they would have eaten the heads of grain. But this gets back to the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees. And they get upset. They confront Jesus. They go to him and say, in Matthew 12, they say, how is it that your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Because it is Saturday, it's the Sabbath, that was their day of rest, and they have broken the law in the eyes of the Pharisees. Now, Jesus calls them guiltless later on, but what had they done? They had broken the law that says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you're to rest. So what was really happening in the story? What law were they breaking? Was that really the law they were breaking? Turns out, the religious leaders had added to the original 10 commandments in the Old Testament. They'd added about 600 or more rules to help you follow the original 10. But those rules had become laws to themselves. So now, instead of, for instance, the one that I always come to, it's my favorite to share, not because it's my favorite rule, it's the one that seems to really speak to this time, is that women, ladies, you were not allowed to look at a mirror on the Sabbath. For fear you would pluck out a gray hair, and that's considered under a different rule, now a law, work. You had been hairdressing on the Sabbath. So to protect you from doing work, we're going to just not let you look in the mirror. Okay, that sounds freeing, right? That's really in there. Those are the rules they had added to this. Well, they apparently had decided that plucking that grain of head was harvesting grain, and to clean it off and eat it was to thresh it. Instead of using an actual threshing floor, they had threshed it in their hand, but they had removed the husk. They had broken the law. So Jesus responds to this, talking about being the Lord of the Sabbath and helping them understand this. But he shares a very curious story as he does in Matthew 12. He says, have you not read about David when he and his men went into the priests and ate the bread of the presence? And you're like, what's the bread of the presence? So I'll tell you that. There was this special bread that the priests would put before God. There were 12 loaves. And in Leviticus 24, only the priests could eat this, it tells us. But they were put out to show the presence before God, God's provision for them. And then once a week, they would put out the new bread, and the priests could eat that bread, and only the priests. But apparently, David eats some of this bread, and he uses that as his quote to help them understand this idea of the Sabbath. So we're going to talk about that today and understand what Jesus was trying to get at. But really, why we get to that is because we're in the book of 1 Samuel. We've been studying through this book, talking about prophets, priests, and kings. But we get to this passage. We get to this story of David eating this bread. Now, the reason David's eating this bread is because he's on the run and he's in the wilderness. We're going through the wilderness years with David. David spends about 10 years in the wilderness, running from King Saul. So we'll unpack that in a little bit. But he is not in the wilderness of his own choosing. Notice that. Saul is out for him. He's jealous of him. And maybe you're in that kind of place today. You feel like you're in kind of that wilderness. David describes it in the Psalms as a dry and thirsty land. Maybe you feel like you're in that dry and thirsty land, and even not of your own choosing. How do you respond in the midst of that? How do we trust God in the midst of those hard and dark times? And so today we're going to see how David responds and trusts God for better and for worse. Not always the best example. But we're going to see that in 1 Samuel chapter 21 today. And I believe this makes application whether you're retired, you're in school, or anywhere in between. Because we all have to understand what does it mean to truly trust God in the hard times. It's easy to trust God in the good times. But what about when things are dry and thirsty? Maybe you're going through transitions. You just moved to the area, building out community, or your kids have just graduated, or you're having kids. We've had people going through all different stages of life and these shifts and transitions. That's really what 1 Samuel's about. They were shifting from a time where God was their king to earthly kings. And the first one was Saul. They said, we want a king like all the other nations. God gives them exactly what they want. And a man named Saul, he's a foot taller than everyone else. His charisma, everything about him on the outside looked good. But he led out of fear. And because of that, he was afraid of the Philistines. He was afraid of the Midianites. And he would do things that didn't go with God's plan. And he was afraid of the people. And so he disobeyed God again. And so finally, God sends the last of the judges, named Samuel. He was a prophet and a priest as well. He goes to Saul and says, the kingdom's going to be taken from you. Your children will not inherit this kingdom. And he feels threatened by that. And then Samuel goes and he anoints King David. Now, he's going to be the second king in the life of Israel. So we're looking during the rise of David. We've looked at this already, how at this point when he's in the wilderness, he is now Jonathan, the son of Saul's best friend. They loved each other heart and soul. And of all people to be jealous is Jonathan. Who should be jealous of David but Jonathan? Jonathan's the oldest son of Saul. He's the one to rightly inherit the kingdom if they follow the rules. But God said it's not going to be him. But Jonathan sees him just as a friend. He's unselfish with him. He marries one of Saul's daughters as part of this. And it was political for Saul. But Michal is the wife of David. And she protects David from Saul because Saul begins to get really jealous of David. He begins to lead well. He defeats the Goliath, the giant Goliath for the Philistines. And so they start singing songs about him. Saul has killed his thousands. David's killed his tens of thousands. Again, out of fear, Saul responds poorly. So David goes on the run. So we pick up in 1 Samuel 21, and I love that we have people from all walks of life. So maybe you've never heard this story, or you had to look up where 1 Samuel is today. However you get there, or whether you grew up in church, I love that we have a way to look at this with fresh eyes today. And so we pick up in verse 1 with some of this. And remember, when you get big words, say them fast and with confidence. So I may have said Michelle wrong. I don't know if Ahimelech is how you say this guy's name. What matters is the story of what God's doing in the life of these people. No one names their kid Ahimelech anymore, so we don't really care. We just need to know about him, okay? I just have to warn you of that when we get to these big words. So again, we pick up with David in the wilderness. David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David trembling. And he said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" So Ahimelech knows something's not right. Why are you here all alone, just with your men? You're not here with the king. They know who David is. But look at what David said to Ahimelech the priest. "The king has charged me with the matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of this matter which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with these young men for such and such a place.'" So David decides to lie. And Ahimelech says, "Why are you here?" "I'm on a secret mission for the king. It's need to know, and you don't need to know." Okay? That's basically what he's telling him. I am on a mission for the king. So I'm kind of a big deal. I need your help. And so next he goes, "When then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here." He's like, "We're hungry. Feed us." Now, why did he lie to Ahimelech? This is the chosen one. Samuel has anointed him. He has already defeated Goliath. And we talked about when we looked at David versus Goliath, anyone who would have stood up for God in that moment and trusted that God's name was to be praised, I believe would have been in the story of David versus Goliath. David is the one that says, "You come at me with sword and spear and javelin. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, whom you've defied." He was trusting in God and his name to carry forth the battle. He says, "He will deliver you into my hands." That same man that's trusting in front of a giant is lying to a priest because what's he afraid of? "Well, Saul's trying to kill me. Well, I can't help you. Let me email Saul that you're here." What's he going to do at this point? But he's afraid. He doesn't trust God, so instead he lies. And so he says, "Can you give me something to eat?" So now we pick up in verse 4. The priest answered David, "I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women. So at least be ceremonially clean. We could feed you that holy bread, that bread of the presence." And David answered the priest. Look at what he says. "Truly women have kept from us as always on my expeditions. These vessels of the young men are holy even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will these vessels be holy?" Because we're on a special mission for the king, they're even more holy than normal. Of course we're worthy of the bread. Again, lying to the priest. And the reason I have a problem with this is he should have given Ahimelech the chance to make his own decision on what he wanted to do in this moment. But instead, David does not trust God in this. So he trusts in his own manipulations. I know what to say. If I just manufacture this, we'll get us some bread. It says, "So the priest gave him the bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it's taken away." Every 7 days, they would replace the bread. So they ate that bread. Now, it just so happened while this is going on in verse 7, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. So he's there, this guy. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Now, that just sounds like a bad guy, right? Doeg the Edomite. He is not a good guy. He's a spy for Saul. He's going to go back and tell Saul what's going down. And so it mentions that. And David actually sees Doeg. He realizes this is probably going to be a problem later on. But that's just kind of a foreshadowing for some later parts of this. So we'll come back to that. But this food was for the priests only. David and his men eat it. And, you think, okay, so what's going to be the ramifications of this? And we're going to get to that because there are consequences because Doeg Edomite was there. But I want to share a little bit more of what happens. Not only does David need food, he doesn't have any weapons. So in verse 8, he says to Ahimelech, have you not a spear or a sword here at hand? For I have brought neither my sword or my weapons with me. So he makes this excuse. The king's business required haste. I was so busy doing the king's business, I forgot to bring, a sword or a spear or anything. Do you have any weapons by chance? Like, how ridiculous does this story have to sound? But Ahimelech just trusts him. He has no reason not to trust David. This is the killer of Goliath. And he even points that out. Verse 9, the sword of Goliath is here, the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah. He says, behold, it's here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here. And David said, there is none like that, give it to me. So I love how Eugene Peterson compares this. Eugene Peterson is a pastor and an author. And right here he says, and with that, David is on his way. He arrives at the holy place hungry and defenseless, and he leaves full and equipped for battle. He comes to the right place, but he lied all the way through to get those things. I think Ahimelech would have honored that for him either way, knowing who he was. But he chose to lie. Now, because of this, there are consequences. So I want to go ahead and mention that to you. In chapter 22, if you read ahead, Doeg the Edomite reports this back to Saul, the king. Saul has Ahimelech and all the priests come to him. He summons them and says, hey, what's this I hear about you helping my enemy David? I didn't know he was your enemy. He told me he was on a special mission for you. I don't believe you. You were working with him. And he has all the priests killed. 85 priests are killed. Only one survived. Ahimelech's son, Abiathar, again, say it fast. Abiathar, he ends up coming to David and tells David what happened. And David says, it's on me. This is my fault. Now, David didn't really realize that Saul would truly kill the priest. That just shows how far this king has fallen. The king of Israel kills 85 priests, even though they're telling him the truth because they were deceived. That's how far Saul has fallen. But even that, David didn't give them a chance to choose to honor that. Instead, they were just deceived. And now his son, Abiathar, is with David. David says, I'll provide for you. I'll protect you as one of my own family. So he comes back up in the story at times after that. But there were consequences to David not trusting God. There were dire consequences for the priests. They died because of this. But I think Jesus is actually going to use Ahimelech in Matthew chapter 12. I think that's who he's looking at when he talks about this story of the Sabbath. But before we can get to that, we got to finish the rest of this curious story. David goes in, he lies. So why is Jesus quoting a story about David lying? This is the future king. Aren't they supposed to be perfect? Yeah, Saul was messed up, but David's going to be perfect, right? 10 feet tall, bulletproof. He never does any wrong. No, we see David's very human. The Bible doesn't shy away from showing us the humanity of people because it's a story of people with real problems, but they have an encounter with a real God. Same as us. We can see ourselves in these stories. We can see ourselves not trusting ourselves to tell the truth, not trusting God enough to tell the truth when we try to massage the truth. We're really here on a special mission. Really, this is why this is happening to me, instead of being honest with ourselves and with others. So this trusting God comes back in because now, after that, David hides out in a place called Gath. And if you go back to chapter 17, you'll find David defeats Goliath. The Philistines run. They rout the Philistines to two major cities. Their capital cities were Ekron and Gath. David says, I've got a plan. I'm going to hide from Saul in Gath, one of the major cities of the Philistines. I happen to have killed their champion named Goliath. Oh, by the way, I'm carrying his sword. Maybe they won't notice me. He was a giant. This is not a small sword. David, Saul probably had no idea he would go there. Who in their right mind would? In fact, that's exactly how David's going to get out of this, is going to act crazy. But he goes to Gath with Goliath's sword. They know who he is. They say, there's songs written about you. Saul has killed his thousands. David's killed his tens of thousands. So they bring him before the king, King Achish, in verse 12. And it says, David took these words to heart that they were singing these songs. He was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. I don't know why, but he's afraid. Is he not God's anointed? So instead, he changed his behavior before them. He pretended to be insane in their hands. He made marks on the doors of the gate, and he let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? I left out verse 15, but he says, don't I have enough madmen already? Aren't there enough crazy people here in my house? Some of you have probably said that about your own family or maybe your workplace. But basically, Achish is like, I don't need another madman around here. So David gets away as a result of this. He flees and gets away by acting insane. Not trusting God, trusting in his own power. Now later, David writes a psalm about this. Remember, David writes some of our psalms. This is the hymn book of the Bible, the worship song of the Bible. Psalm 34, sometimes they will tell us what was happening while David writes this song. And he says in Psalm 34, it's while he was fleeing and he acted insane before King Achish. And basically what he says in that was he realized God was protecting him all along. Where can I run to? You are my refuge. Instead of running to God for refuge, though, he tried to do it in his own power. And he's realizing that now as he looks at these stories. God is my stronghold. So it's a question of trusting God. You got to be honest with others and honest with ourselves. And David was neither in these stories. It's not a perfect picture of that. And yet we have Jesus quoting this story in the New Testament. Why would Jesus bring up the story where David lies and gets a bunch of priests killed? And I think it's more about the priest Ahimelech and really the spirit behind all of that. Because I want to jump back to that for a second. We're going to continue in this series of David on the run, David in the wilderness. And he makes some bad choices today. But Jesus tells us about what it means to truly trust God. We see and maybe we can identify with David. I've been there. I've tried to tell my version of the story in a way that would get people to take my side of what's going on. Or maybe it is no fault of your own, but you're trying to do it. If I can do it in my own power, great. And if all else fails, well, then I will call on God. That's how a lot of people look at following God. I'm going to do it. And when I can't do it, then I'll ask for help. Instead of running to him first. David, before it's over with, learns to run to God first. Finds his refuge, finds his strength. But learning to trust God, especially with the Sabbath was a picture of learning to trust God. So Matthew chapter 12, again, the disciples are confronted for eating on the Sabbath. They have unlawfully worked on the Sabbath. Jesus is going to call them guiltless. And so he tells them, have you not read about David when he fed the men with the bread of the presence? And then he goes on to say, and the priests, they have to profane the temple. They work on the Sabbath. I mean, it's required for them to work. And so he says to them in chapter 12, verse 6, he says this. He says, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. Now, there are people that will say Jesus did not think he was God. They will say he was a good man, he was a good teacher, but he never thought himself to be God. Then you look at passages like this. There is someone who is greater than the temple. What was greater than the temple? But God. He's going to call himself the Son of Man, and he's going to say the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. That's very strong words for who Jesus knew himself to be. It was his favorite reference to himself. He would call himself the Son of Man. The Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And so C.S. Lewis puts it this way. One of the older authors, he talks about this dilemma or trilemma about Jesus. You have to decide one of three things about Jesus. Either Jesus is a liar. He didn't really believe all these things, but he makes the claims. When he goes to the religious leaders and says, before Abraham was, I am. Because they said, how can you know what God was thinking? Are you older than Abraham? He says, before Abraham was, I am. They knew what he meant because they picked up stones to stone him. They knew he knew what he was talking about. He was not messing around at that point. And so either he's a liar, he made that up, or maybe he's a lunatic. He's just crazy. He thinks he's God. Again, why would we? He's a really great teacher. He loved others. He helped us a lot. He's really crazy, but he was a really good guy. Like that's one of the ways you can look at Jesus, but it's really hard to say, well, I can take his teachings, but he's also really crazy. Or you have to decide liar, lunatic, or is he Lord of all? He comes walking on the water to his disciples and says, do not be afraid. I am is here. I think he knew who he was, walking on the water, calling himself I am, the name for God in the Old Testament, Yahweh. That's how they would have understood that. He knew who he was. Something greater than the temple is here. You tear this down, I will rebuild it in 3 days, he tells them. He knew who he was. And so he's trying to help them understand what this means. So something greater than the temple is here today. Right before them, they're experiencing it. And he says, and if you had known what this means, quoting out the book of Hosea, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And here it is, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. That's a strong statement by Jesus. Who is Lord of the Sabbath? The Son of Man is. Who is the Son of Man, Lord of the Sabbath? It's got to be an understanding that he knew himself not to be just a man, just a prophet, just a teacher. He was God himself. He's trying to help them understand this Hosea 6:6 passage that he says, where you know this, Hosea 6, in the Old Testament, the prophet Hosea is writing to the people. They're not repenting. They're not turning from their ways, but they're going through the motions. They're still offering sacrifices. They're still, think about it, they're still going to church. They're still doing all the things they're supposed to, but their hearts are far from God. And God says, for I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. It's not that God didn't care about holiness, that he did not care about these sacrifices, these offerings, but the relationship had to be there. It's like when you tie a dog up to a tree and you tell it to stay. That's not real obedience. There's no real... God wants that relationship with us so that the obedience comes as a response to knowing him, the knowledge of God. The religious leaders during Jesus' time, they were following all the rules. On the outside, they looked good, just like Saul. For instance, on the outward, man looks on the outside, it says, but God looks at the heart. God tells us when he picked David, he wants a heart after his own. Means chasing after God's own heart here. And so when we look at the stories like this, we see the story of someone who is struggling with the rules. And so they're mad at Jesus and his disciples for breaking the rules, because that's what they cared about, the rules. And there are people today that are caught up in that. If I follow all the rules, then God will love me. That's the definition of religion, by the way. Religion is man's attempt to reach God. I do all these things so God will love me. And then here comes Jesus, God's attempt to reach man. He's basically saying God's already loved us, and he's shown his love for us by dying on the cross. He took on flesh. He emptied himself and died on the cross as atonement for us, as a ransom for us. He who knew no sin became sin so that we might be called children of God. That's the good news. And they're having trouble with just the Sabbath. Remember, Sabbath was trust. It's about trusting God. Do you trust that what Jesus did on the cross was enough? Or is it in what you can do in your own power? Think about this on the Sabbath. The Sabbath, God says 6 days you'll work, you won't on the seventh. I know it's a hardship, God tells them. This is an agrarian society. They're farmers. They work with their cattle and their animals. 1 day a week you got to take off means one less day tilling the soil, planting the seeds, keeping up the weeds, harvesting, all the things they needed to do. God was saying, this is a hardship. I want you to learn to rest, because you could just as easily be out there doing one more day of work. But I want you to learn to trust me, God is saying, that I can do more in your life with 6 days than you can accomplish in your own power in 7. That's Sabbath. It's like tithing. God wants to show us, I can do more with 90% than you can do in your own power in 100%. How many of us are saying, I know God, you're telling me Jesus died for my sins, but I want to earn this. I want to do it in my own power. God can do way more in his power than we can do in our own. It's learning to trust God. Same with Sabbath. I think it was Ahimelech that desired mercy over sacrifice when he fed David. I don't think this was about showing what David did. I think this was about the priest who knew what was the right thing to do, because he had a relationship with the God he served. And do you have that relationship? Do you know him? Or are you just going through the motions? Do you feel disconnected from God, but you got to follow all the rules? And there's a lot of people out there filled with guilt and shame because that's what they're trying to do instead of being set free. In Matthew chapter 11, just the chapter before this, Jesus talks to the people. They've been weighed down by rules like women, you can't look in the mirror. Guys, don't even touch a head of grain. We're going to define that as work. He says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And for those of us that are exhausted, that sounds great, right? Rest. But he wasn't just talking about that. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls. It's soul rest we're talking about today. That continual fight to try to earn God's love. When we realize God has already shown his love for us. While we were still sinners, Romans tells us, Christ died for us. So we can rest in that fact today. And so it's taking on his yoke. That was the thing they would put around the cattle to help them pull the plow and things. They were made for that. It was the yoke was made for them. It made the work go easier. It's like when you realize you were made for this, there's something powerful about it. It's not just work anymore. You get to do these things. We were created to worship God. and to find a relationship with him. That's what we're talking about today. But it starts with trusting God. Do you trust him? Have you learned to trust him in resting? As pastors, I meet with a group of pastors all the time, and over the years, I've met with different pastor groups, and every time you say, what's the one thing you struggle with? We'll all get around to this idea of Sabbath, because today's not rest for me. It's kind of hard to make that the rest day. But then Monday, you got to get started because there's so much to do to get caught up. And by Friday, it's like, well, I really need to tighten things up before Sunday. And so finding a place to rest, again, that's just as much trust for me as anything. But we all want to do it in our own power until we run out of options. That's not Sabbath. That's not tithing. That's not true salvation and trusting that Jesus did enough on the cross for us. Can we learn to trust him today, wherever you're at? So I want to invite you to do that. In a moment, I'm going to pray and we're going to continue to worship. But maybe you're here and you've never responded to Christ as King. You say, I'm ready. You've been kicking the tires on Christianity, or you want to know more, you can come to me in the back and say, I want to follow Jesus, or I want to become a Christian. I don't know what you mean. And we'll start there on this journey of accepting what Jesus did on the cross as our response to that is simply understanding grace. And if you need help with that, come see me. If you're online, just put Jesus in the comments. I'll reach out to you, or send a private message if you want to. However you do that, we just want to give everyone the opportunity to respond to Jesus as our King today. But maybe you're in that wilderness. You're struggling to trust. You know Jesus, but you're still struggling in those places. It's a chance to just press in today and press into God as our stronghold. Instead of trying to figure it all out, run to him first. Find him as our stronghold. Find him as our peace. He is enough. And we want to invite you to have that freedom. So in a moment, as we continue to sing, you can stand and sing, or you can stay where you're at, or go to the prayer space. Again, no one's looking around. No one's trying to figure out who's doing what. We just want to give you the freedom to respond. You know, in the Bible, there was an altar. People would go to the altar to do business with God. That's what an altar was there for. You can do business with God right where you're at. You can make an altar where you're sitting. You can make an altar at that prayer space. Wherever you want to do business with God today, I just hope you'll respond to what he's leading and then go from there. So let's pray. Father God, we thank you for this time. And I pray that anything I said that was distracting, God, you'd help that just wash past our ears. But God, your truth would truly sink deeply into our hearts, that it would change us. We'd be more like you. I pray for those that are really considering you as King. I pray that you would reveal yourself to them right now. I pray there would be peace in this place. I pray that there would be rejoicing over lives changed. In your name we pray. Amen.